Thank you all for coming, and Jasper, thank you for these very kind words, and really for 3 fabulous years of collaboration. This has been honestly a lot of fun, some hard work, some difficult choices, but a lot of fun. And I think that any of you who have not seen the exhibition will really see that a lot of thought and care has been put into this, and hopefully for your benefit. Jasper mentioned that I began my professional life as a psychologist, and I was actually first gave this talk on the day of my father's centenary in the city of his birthplace, which is today called Daugavpils in Latvia. It was when he was born. It was Dvinsk as part of the Russian Empire, and I was invited really, I think, because they wanted me to essentially do a psychoanalysis of my father, and I wasn't really that excited about that idea, so I sort of turned the tables and I made this talk and said how Rothko's paintings actually get inside us on a psychological level, what they teach us about ourselves, because I think my father's work is certainly psychologically informed. Now that was 17 years ago. That talk was actually the first talk I ever gave. That talk became a book chapter, then an essay, and then back into a lecture. And I have some very good news, because that talk began life 1 hour and 45 minutes long. It has gotten shortened considerably. So I hope you enjoy it in its somewhat more compact form. I enjoy it in its more compact form, I can assure you that. So, actually, I've not used this yet. Let's see if this actually works. I can just do it from here. That work? That works. Okay. Mark Rothko's paintings, especially his classic works, have long been viewed as expressions of feeling. They're broad expanses of paint, they're bold juxtapositions of color, they're frameless, all-over painting that often seems to reach for further space. All of these elements speak to something that is being declared, something which the artist cannot contain and which he must make public. This is the very opposite of art which attempts to reflect or capture what is in the tangible world of objects around us. There is no pastoral scene, no glowering royal countenance. There is no likeness being rendered, nor do these seemingly minimalist abstractions appear to convey flights of fancy or a new view of the world through a unique lens. There is no external world here, no scene to grasp onto, no place or frame of reference. The surface seems so void of content, of action, of narrative, ultimately of any cues that would tie them concretely to the world of objects. And yet these paintings are not voids. The great Italian filmmaker Michelangelo Antonioni sought out my father in the 1960s, eager to have a meeting in mind. "You paint nothing, I film nothing," he said, as a sort of introduction to this conversation. And one can certainly understand what he meant: the open spaces, the unadorned abstraction, the aching search for meaning that marks both of their work. There is a phenotypic similarity in their best-known pieces that presents the viewer with an emptiness that must somehow be filled. But here the comparison breaks down, and I will let you know right now I am not a film critic or scholar, but whereas Antonioni seems to present us with a man-made world as vacuous as it is artificial, Rothko's paintings, for all their reduction in means, are bursting with energy and alive with the human spirit. The void they present is only a void of reference to the outside world, and this precisely because my father sought to remove the distractions and preoccupations of the material realm. He wanted to shift our focus and draw our attention to the inner world, the world of ideas, and most critically, the world of emotions. And just to let you know, the still I show here is from his Antonioni's masterpiece, Deserto Rosso, and this is one of my father's late works on canvas from 1969, or perhaps even into 1970, and it's actually in the exhibition. Rothko's goal was to connect with the human spirit, to express what he called the human condition. Now, this is not a radical idea. In many ways, it's a highly romantic notion with a refreshing touch of naivete and such an intellectual and serious painter. No, in fact, Rothko's great innovation was in the means he used to achieve this expressive goal, the boldness to throw away most painterly elements in an attempt to penetrate to the heart of our emotional world with a single arrow. People talk of great art expressing the inexpressible, and this is clearly the realm that preoccupied my father. Art that is narrative, descriptive, or reflective of its time and place is inherently limited to the bounds of its frame, and that's a physical, a social, and a temporal frame. This is painting that, at least on its most basic level, could be expressed in words. Now, of course, we all know countless works that transcend the conventionality of their subjects and communicate to us in a profound and deeply emotional way. But Rothko sought to leap neatly over all those pictorial elements and through direct and blunted expressive means speak straight to our inner selves. One can see this even in his earliest figurative work, where there is often no focus on character, no attempt to tell you what kind of people he has painted. Instead, the focus is on their state, their condition, where they are physically, and how this has affected them. That is, how this has affected them emotionally. Already there's a type of abstraction, and not just in the roughly drawn figures. These are not people who we can get to know. They are figurative representations of a feeling, of a human condition, that most of us will know in our own personal way. But that human condition is equally present in his classic color-field paintings, works my father referred to, without irony I might add, he referred to these works as dramas. Now, of all the statements my father made about his work, and he did not actually make very many, I think this is perhaps the most enlightening. First, because drama places us definitively in the human realm. The paintings are not about color, they're not about form, the process of viewing, and they are not about abstract ideas. The paintings are a stage for human concerns and human interaction, as drama, unlike narrative, inherently involves interaction. Secondly, seeing the paintings as dramas takes us out of the realm of the static and shifts our focus away from the surface. For what types of dramas are these, if they are not psychological dramas? There are no tangible actors on this stage, just raw feelings, expressed ever so directly, sometimes with almost brutal power, and sometimes more caressingly. These feelings, mediated only through the most basic elements of color and form, are in constant interplay, sometimes harmonious, sometimes contentious, and almost always, like real emotions, in those ambivalent mixtures which continually tint our world. There are no black and white Rothkos, just as I suspect that there is really very little black and white in our own lives. And now I'm going to show you a black and white Rothko, but it's a photograph. Let us consider some typical response from viewers to Rothko's work. These may help us understand the ways in which the paintings interact with us. Moving is the word I most frequently hear from those who love Rothko. I think this word is significant because it speaks to the physicality of our emotional response. We are on such an elemental level that we're having a bodily reaction to the work. It is primitive, visceral. Movement also brings up the notion of things resonating, of being stirred. When the window on the soul is looked through, when the interaction between viewer and painting genuinely occurs, then a chord is struck, and the reaction, at least in part, is basic, physical, and involuntary. The most striking manifestation of a physical response to a Rothko painting is crying. To see a viewer in tears before a Rothko is not uncommon, and at least in my experience, occurs as frequently with men as with women. My father was keenly aware that people were moved to tears before his paintings and was frankly rather proud of it. He cited it as evidence that his work truly was brimming with content, specifically tragic content, and that not only could he, but he did reach his viewers in a profound and affecting way. So, why tears? It's not that the paintings themselves are sad. As we have discussed, they have so little socially referenced content, it is not clear what would carry the message of sadness. One could argue that color carries this message, but it's too simple and often actually misleading to equate the brightly colored paintings with joyous feelings and the darker ones with sadness. And I can add that in my own limited research on this topic, I have found that viewers cry as often before the light-colored works as before the dark ones. Ultimately, I believe this examination of sadness is somewhat off the mark, for it is not at all clear that the tears shed before a Rothko painting are tears of sadness. Those predisposed to do so cry in many different states, in joy or rage, in relief or fear, in accomplishment or failure, and I will add, at weddings as often as at funerals. Our emotional experience before a Rothko is an essentially physical process, like a wind through a pipe or a vibration across a string. That causes a note to sound. Something is struck or strummed or plucked or bowed or hammered or brushed, and from a place before conscious thought, the tears come. Unbidden, but not necessarily unwelcome. This is not sadness, this is meaning deeply felt. So what are some of the mechanisms, psychological and artistic, which allow Rothko's work to communicate on an emotional level? Our first instinct is to look at color, but I cannot state clearly or emphatically enough that it is a mistake to equate Rothko paintings with color. My father's paintings are gestalts, carefully balanced visual wholes, and when they fail to achieve their most persuasive emotional expression, it is rarely because the colors are not beautiful or well chosen. It is usually because their formal balance is not quite optimal. So that said, let us examine some of the other mechanisms that bring expressive power to the work. The first of these mechanisms I call nebulousness. That is, the cloudiness or indistinctness of the image that is common to all the periods. Whether it is in human figures, such as this 1930, early 30s work known as Family, which is actually in our exhibition, or something more primordial from the Surrealist phase. This is Aeolian Harp, also in our exhibition. The uncoalesced blots of color, known as the multiforms, a work from circa 1947 from the National Gallery's collection and also in this exhibition. Or the floating classic rectangles, a very small, deceptively small 1954 work in my sister's collection. No matter what period we're talking about, with any of these paintings, one rarely feels that the image is fully in focus. We are not entirely clear who or what we are seeing. This indistinctness means that we need to work a little harder and that we are already drawn into an active relationship with the painting. But the nebulousness also invites a type of projection, and I would argue an emotionally tinged projection. The artist is not telling us exactly what he is showing us. We must make our own sense of it through the mechanisms of our own psychological processes. And ultimately, we bring some of ourselves and put this onto the painting as we are coming to that understanding. Action is a second technical means my father employed to convey emotion. Perhaps it is ironic that I should put this forth for a color field painter, but while undoubtedly more subtle and less central than it is for Pollock or Klein, action is a key attribute of my father's work. Whether it is the powerful movement of line in the Surrealist watercolors, it's a beautiful example from around 1944, or the working of the paint in some of the classic works. A very early classic work from 1949, or the unexpected turmoil of this supposedly depression-damped Black and Grays of 1969. Movement is elemental in the work. Perhaps even more powerful is the dynamism of color. This is easily seen in the constant interplay of color in the multiforms, or the explosion of colors that occurs around the borders of many of the classic works. And here I make a small detail of the left edge where you can see all the many colors coming into action, not just the colors on the surface, but the 6, 8, 10 layers of color underlying that surface, blue and red. In these small areas of juxtaposition, the emotional energy is at its highest and becomes nearly kinetic. Two additional expressive mechanisms pertain primarily to the classic paintings, although pre-echoes are present in the earlier work. The first of these is what I refer to as the inner glow of some of the most moving classic works. It is a glow that tells you that there is content beneath the surface, one that acts as an embracing invitation to turn inward. It is the window of inner light. This is a 1951 painting in the National Gallery's collection. The second of these emotional tools is the quiet presence of imperfection in virtually all of the work. Here I have contrasted a 1950s Joseph Albers' homage to the square with Rothko's number 12, 1951. Despite the commonality of bright color and quasi-geometric presentation, the feeling emanating from the two paintings could not be more different. For all their regularity and formal cleanliness, Rothko's paintings are clearly the work of the human hand. These are not Albers, or for that matter, Barnett Newman's or Reinhardt's. The human factor, with all its fallibility, is present everywhere, in the work of the brush, in the forms that in truth only suggest rectangles, and the drips and splatters that mark every seemingly pristine surface. These subtle cues are not so much intended to engage the viewer in the process of painting, but to lend the work an extra degree of the personal. These human elements reinforce the unconscious awareness that viewing a painting is an interaction between two people. The final expressive mechanism I wish to touch on is what my father saw as the essential content of his work, not simply drama, but specifically tragic drama, what he called the tragedy of the human condition. My father most likely turned to Nietzsche, but I will turn to Aristotle to help elucidate the workings of the tragic content in the paintings. Writing in the Poetics, Aristotle speaks of the finest tragedies arousing pity and fear in the spectator. Pity he defines as the human feeling occasioned by undeserved misfortune. The feeling of fear, however, stems from witnessing misfortune in one like ourselves. It is this second feeling, fear, but more particularly the recognition of one like ourselves, which was crucial to my father. When faced with a painting, my father did not want the viewer to see it as something other, but as something directly relevant to the self, something that spoke to him or her in an immediate way about his or her own life. The tragic elements in the work must resonate with the viewer, arousing a sense of familiarity from their own inner world. This is not to underplay the more fearsome aspects of fear. There is a strong current of existential angst in Rothko's work, a preoccupation with death and ultimate causes. And yet, that does not seem to be the primary thrust for him in his embracing of the tragic. In reference to tragic doom, he writes, "The fear of death and pain and frustration seems like the most constant binder between human beings. And we know that a common enemy is a much better coalescer of energies than is a common positive end. The tragic is then for him the ultimate expression of the common experience of mankind. He focuses on the essences, the defining elements of what it means to be human." The second significant aspect of tragic content is, well, of course, the content. It was no less crucial for Aristotle. He writes, that the tragic fear and pity may be aroused by the spectacle, but they may also be aroused by the very structure and incidents of the play, which is the better way and shows the better poet. Rothko, too, had no use for spectacle. He was not interested in visual effects and artifice, but interested in the direct communication of the subject of his work. The forms and colors of his works are like the structure and incidents of Aristotle's play. They are not there to stir what Aristotle called the spectacle of horror, but instead that pleasure of pity and fear. For Rothko, the surface is just that, surface. It is there only to serve the expression of the painting's content. How can we reckon that focus on the tragic with the many paintings that exude passion, exuberance, even joy? This particularly, I think, almost tranquil painting from 1954 in one of the beautiful cupola bays of the exhibition. As at least a partial answer, I will offer the example of Mozart, who was by a considerable margin my father's favorite composer. Mozart generally wears a genial face. His pieces so tuneful, they are frequently canned into packages of background music, much as my father's work is often reduced to wall decoration. But listening to Mozart carefully and openly, one becomes aware of the sadness, the longing, the ache of human suffering. My father would often say that Mozart was smiling through tears, and I would suggest that perhaps the same was true for him. At the core of Rothko's work is the interaction between viewer and painting, or rather between viewer and painter. Seeing the paintings not as a culmination of formal means or painterly processes, but instead as acts of communication, will enhance our understanding of why they affect us so. For this was my father's career-long goal, not to express himself, but to interact, indeed to hold a conversation with his viewer. Now, I do not usually like to dwell on the process of writing, but I need to share with you a slip that I made when I was first preparing this talk. And I will tell you that psychologists love slips. They are seen as a direct pathway into the unconscious, so I'm in fact sharing a bit of my insides with you. So in this case, I had meant to write the words content and impact, referring to how Rothko's paintings affect us. But instead of writing content and impact, I accidentally combined the two and wrote contact. Eureka, I shouted, because that's exactly what I was trying to capture. Rothko's paintings are about an encounter, a meeting of minds or souls between artist and viewer. We all try to make contact, superficially through a wave, an exchanged glance, a telephone call, more deeply through intimacy with those we feel truly understand us. My father's needs and aims were no different, but he sought to make contact through the intermediary of art. And I have to tell you at this point that I began to imagine my father wandering around the streets of New York, trying to have conversations with the most casual passerby, but needing to carry around a 2-meter painting in order to do so. I'll give you a brief version of that. This actually in the studio, but imagine him wandering around the streets of New York with that in hand. Now we know pretty clearly from the outset what he's trying to communicate, that tragic content, our shared experience of the human condition. His quest as an artist was to find a medium that could convey that content universally, that tapped into our common experience and our psychological workings. He found through years of experimentation that the more elementally he expressed his version of the human, the more directly he could touch those places and speak with us about what it meant to be alive. Now, in just a few minutes, we're going to consider period by period that journey of development. But I want to be clear and really emphasize from the beginning that development of his style was really just one of language, but not one of content or message. There's one thing that I would love for you to take away with you tonight. It's that this painting on the left and this painting on the right are essentially the same thing. Expressed differently, no doubt, but ultimately trying to speak to us and speaks to the very same part of us. My father's development was one of stripping away layers to achieve greater and greater clarity, to achieve what he called the simple expression of a complex thought. But that thought was there from the very first. My father spent more than 15 years as an essentially realist painter. This is not to say he sought to make perfect, objective depictions of the world he saw, but that he painted the world around him and filled it with generally recognizable figures. His version of that world was in fact highly subjective and dealt more with inner truths than outward detail or accuracy of visual representation. Stylistically, this period is highly varied and includes a number of different genres, such as landscapes and portraits. This painting on the right is one of my father's very earliest works, and we are almost certain it is a portrait of his mother. Quite a few nudes. This work my father hung throughout his life. It hung in his bedroom. My sister remembers seeing this many times. My mother simply referred to her as the girl with the pointed ass. Great powers of observation there. And perhaps most importantly, what I like to refer to, this is my psychologist self coming through, as the urban psychodrama. This is one of many examples, a particularly rich one, I think, from the National Gallery's collection. I'm not quite sure what this mother and daughter are seeing, but clearly it has them concerned and amazed. While there are many paintings from this period that are light, cheerful, even occasionally superficial, it is those which most directly express the tragic elements I find that most compel. Fear, an amorphous, ill-defined fear, is often lurking at the edges of otherwise untroubled images. More often, it is starkly and dramatically present, as in these two works. In neither case can we see the feared object, or even often offer a reasonable guess at its source. And while the fear we read in the faces has an acute edge to it, there is also the sense that it is a wearing, omnipresent, habitual fear, one that has become a dispiriting and familiar part of their existence. Now, perhaps my father's best-known work from this period is the series of paintings he made in the New York subways in the 1930s. We have three lovely examples of it in our exhibition, the one on the left being one of those, one of my father's actually last paintings in a figurative style. And in this painting, particularly the one on the left, you see almost Giacometti-like figures that all but disappear behind the support pillars. And on the right, the hunched men and women who blend into the drab gray-green walls of the subway. The subway in the 1930s, and I have to tell you, in the early 21st century, it's not much better. It encapsulated the dehumanizing aspects of urban existence with its stifling air, depressing color surroundings, and insect-like behavior it demanded of its riders. There was no room for individuals in the subway, only faceless masses. My father saw the effects of the crushing urban environment on the people around him and depicted these effects in paintings filled with sadness and bitter irony. But for Rothko, it is not so much the masses who are suffering. It is the individual subsumed in that mass who is struggling to break free. It is that individual psychological drama that interests him, not the larger social phenomenon or plight of the people as an oppressed class. It is 1940. That ultimate freeing of form and emotional voice is still 10 years away, but Rothko is about to take the first of two very important steps. First, struck by the vibrancy of the Surrealist movement, which had recently swept the art world, he adopts, as do his contemporaries, elements of its method and stylistic framework, even as he rejects much of its philosophical rhetoric. While his aesthetic world is influenced by the great European surrealists who have fled war-torn Europe, it is essential to note that Rothko adopts a style, in large part, because it takes him in the direction towards which he has already been striving. That is, in a more immediate and universal way of expressing the human condition. Thus begins his deconstruction of the figure, quite literally, as in the case of Oedipus on my left. And it's a deconstruction that will ultimately lead him to abstraction. While there are several levels on which to understand these paintings, what is essential to us here is Rothko's breaking down a convention, both pictorial convention and conventional ways of viewing the subject, as he essentially turns the portrait inside out. He is stripping away typical societal reference and our typical conscious understanding of humanness in a social context. He's appealing to a more basic, a more primitive part of us, bypassing the outside and going straight to the innards, as in the case of poor Oedipus, as I mentioned before, on the left behind me. In this effort to communicate on a more elemental level, my father, like many of the artists around him, embraced myth as source of content for his works. Myth appealed to him because it embodied a more universal language, full of elements that would be grasped by a large number of people. More importantly, one of the cultural functions of myth is to represent, through story, the basic existential questions of the human world. Myths address our most elemental thoughts and feelings. So by using myth, my father felt he could more directly address the basic human concerns and speak more immediately to our inner world. Perhaps influenced by Carl Jung and intrigued by the power of the unconscious and preconscious processes, my father's paintings became increasingly abstract and fanciful, beginning in 1943. These are two lovely watercolor examples from around that period. The figures are now barely recognizable, and they seem to come from some earlier epoch in human existence, or perhaps further up the phylogenetic tree. They are primitive as they are as primitive as the thoughts they represent, a transliteration of the language of the unconscious. They speak not so much to our waking mind as to the world of dreams, those most elemental parts of ourselves which serve as the cradle of the emotions. Most striking in these works is the new assertion of the brush. This painting is Rites of Lilith, one of only 3 large-scale paintings that he makes during this period. It's a work of really striking power, vehemence, and anger, almost unprecedented in his career. And the brush here does not hide itself in even strokes. It comes bursting to the fore, providing an active and sometimes turbulent field for the figures. These are not quiet works. They remind us the violence that my father had insisted was even part of his sunniest classic canvases. There is a volcanic energy of the primordial world here. And although transformed as his style changed, it would remain an essential element of his work up through the last paintings. A movement towards greater and greater freedom is certainly the hallmark of the so-called multiform period of my father's work. This is the briefest stylistic period of my father's career, lasting from just 1946 to 1948. It constitutes the essential transitional step to the classic sectional work. It is also his first wholly original painting, not rooted in an older European tradition. As 1946 moved forward, the abstract figures of his surrealist work continued to break down until there was nothing left but the colors that had accompanied their shape. And I will show you this over a suite of 3 paintings. This is a very late surrealist or early transitional multiform of sometime in 1946, and then perhaps a few weeks later. And then by 1947, he is painting works such as this, where he has already brought that bold color palette to the fore that we'll see in the classic paintings of the 1950s. And he'll be working painting by painting in progress towards what we think of as a Rothko painting. My father abandoned myth in the previous 2 years in large part because it constrained him. It provided a pathway to the unconscious, emotion-laden processes, but it was an inherently culture-bound language. One needed to know the story of the myth and understand it in the context of its culture in order to engage with the painting. But more importantly, the language of myth was an adopted one. It was not Rothko's own. As myth receded the role of subtext, color, which had helped carry the message of the mythic figures, came forward, and by the end of 1946, color had become Rothko's new vocabulary. Two more examples from sometime in 1947 or 48. These colors, although carefully chosen, also speak to a type of abandon. They push and clash against one another in amorphous shapes that barely contain their content. They are bold, encompassing the dynamism of line and brush from the previous period, looking to bring the inner emotional level to the surface. Yet for all their freedom and their openness of emotional content, the impact upon the inner world of the viewer has not been fully realized. Much of the raw power we will soon see in Rothko's classic work is on view here, but has not yet been harnessed into the hammer stroke of intent. By early 1949, we can see that Rothko has brought virtually all the elements together, but the artist needs one more bold leap to strip away one further layer and bring focus to the inner world he is showing us. The classic work are Rothko's signature paintings and are well known for the deep feelings they evoke and their ability to speak the language of the sublime. They touch us because they know exactly where we live. They speak to us saying something on the order of, "This is what it feels like to feel this way." They are essentially the painted expression of what it is to be human and alive, filled with joy and sorrow, aspiration and despair, fears and hopes, and fears about our hopes. Is this greatly different from what my father's works have been saying for the previous 30 years? No, I'm not sure it's any different at all. It is simply that my father is speaking in a different voice, bold, impassioned, and confident. What are the elements that allow the classic works to touch us so deeply? Perhaps the most important aspect is that my father has finally found his universal language, color. Although different colors undoubtedly have different cultural connotations, my father was able to juxtapose them and present them in a way such that each painting functioned as its own world, where the colors had their own meaning, specific to the context of that painting. In this way, he made color his own language, but a language with the potential to speak to every viewer. This is an enormous painting from 1957 in my collection. I'm not actually sure we could have fit it in the door. The sheer sweep, size, and resulting power of many of the classic works is a second important element in their ability to move us. While I have argued ad nauseum that many of the greatest works are small, I have come to realize that this is the viewpoint of someone who has already been fully entranced by the large works. The large paintings envelop the viewer and invite him or her in. It is an invitation to a self-contained world where one can lose oneself and perhaps in the process find oneself. And for all their grandness of scale, it is an intimate experience, a world unique to that particular encounter. It is not an accident that many of the paintings are person-sized, and that my father urged curators to hang them close to the floor, where the viewer can all but step into them. Rothko wanted you in the painting to essentially look one another in the eye. Finally, there are the multiple layers of paint my father built up to achieve the effects of color and luminosity that are keys to the emotional impact of the work. I bring back this small but quite beautiful painting from my sister's collection of 1949. And when I say built up, it's not quite the right term, because in many cases the layers of color are so thinned, oil paint thinned by a great deal of turpentine. These layers are so thin that they become semi-transparent, and they really become a veil for the color behind to shine through. And my sense of these layers is that they are a type of visual representation of emotional complexity. The feelings which these paintings touch are by no means unidimensional. They are rich and multifaceted and inherently contradictory. When we see layers of pink and green contributing to the makeup of a seemingly brooding black, we know that we are dealing neither with greeting card images nor with greeting card emotions. We are delving into the many layered constructions of the inner world. And yet, for all the clarity of expression that Rothko achieves in his classic work, there remains a primary paradox that we must unravel. On one hand, we are faced with art that strives to be universal and communicate at the most basic human level. And yet, that communication can only occur meaningfully with the individual, and the meaning derived can only be understood on a personal level. My father not only acknowledged, but espoused the need for his paintings to be seen by the solitary observer. He spoke of having small chapels around the country where the lone traveler could stop and encounter one of his paintings. Similarly, the room of 4 Rothko paintings at the Phillips Collection in Washington, which he helped design, is really quite small and intimate. It quickly feels intruded upon if another viewer enters. And I think I can say with some confidence that most of us have had the experience of failing to have a moving experience with a Rothko painting when surrounded by dozens of other viewers taking in the same exhibition. More troubling than the physical requirements for effectively viewing Rothko paintings are the implications for the meaning of the work that stem from this highly individualized approach. For what can we conclude about the content of the work if each person finds a different meaning? Can one viewer's response be just as valid as the next? Does this not invite idiosyncrasy and, in fact, misunderstanding? These questions might not give us so much pause with other work. After all, are we not talking about the essence of interpretation? But my father's work thrives. In fact, it only succeeds at all because of the universality of its language. And yet, we do not seem to be in the realm of universal conclusions. Further, my father was emphatic about the work's content. There is no such thing as good painting about nothing, he once said. And that was declared by this painter of seemingly empty rectangles. He also spoke about art always moving towards clarity. But where can one find clarity in this cacophony of individualized responses? Is there, in fact, any specific content to his work? I've asked a lot of questions. I will now venture a few answers to the paradox raised by Rothko's work. To my mind, the truth of the work, if you will, lies in the interaction between painting and viewer. And I will even posit that these are hardly paintings at all, but suggestions, ideas expressed through color and form. And that those ideas only come into being and take on specific meaning, that is, personal meaning, at the moment of that interaction. The painting, and ultimately the painter, has a unique dialogue with each individual. Just as we can discuss the same topic and even make the same arguments with different persons and find that those conversations yield very different results. What is occurring with Rothko's works is a type of chemistry between artist and viewer, a primal pre-verbal communication mediated by the painting. It is not that the paintings are without content. They speak volumes, but communication only occurs in the meeting with the viewer. The individual brings his or her own material to that interaction, and meaning comes into being when the content of the painting and the content from the viewer come together. The paintings speak a universal, deeply human language, but we still hear with different ears that bring us different messages, meanings that stem from our own inner worlds. A consideration of my father's work from the last decade of his life, the 1960s, helps clarify, I believe, this process of interaction. This is a 1960 work, also at the very conclusion of our exhibition. Now, some viewers struggle with the work of the 1960s, typically suggesting that the generally darker colors are less appealing, even depressing. I don't believe, however, that this is the primary reason for their difficulty. For what began to change subtly several years after my father's palette began to darken was the means he used to express the emotional content of his work. Stripping away still more layers in search of clarity, the paintings become formally tighter, the rectangles more regular in shape, the layers of color were reduced, and the brushwork grew less and less visible, until reappearing in dramatic fashion in the last 2 years of his life. This further simplification of his style can give the impression of less energy, of emotional restraint in comparison to the outpourings of feeling in the 1950s paintings. It is not the case, however, that these works are any less driven by or less derived from emotion than their predecessors. It is simply that the emotional material has become highly focused and the content more specific. Color still carries the message, looking to engage with our innermost selves, but rather than bright, broad brushstrokes of feeling, we are presented with more pinpointed emotions expressed through subtle interplay of very carefully juxtaposed colors. The weight and spatial relationships of the forms has also become very precisely balanced. Some of the earlier freedom is now gone. One could almost accuse my father of exerting a type of emotional control over the viewer. There's one more crucial aspect of the 1960s work that makes it more difficult, and I would argue greater, than the work of the 1950s. Rothko is quite simply demanding more from his viewer. The demand is not in terms of harder work to understand the painting, it is an emotional demand. The viewer needs to bring more of him or herself to the painting. The color does not leap off the canvas or lure you in the same way. You need to meet these paintings more than halfway and offer more of your own personal input. The primary visual mechanism responsible for this essential change in the character of the paintings is reflectivity. Whereas the many layers of colors of the 1950 paintings gave them a luminous glow from within, the rectangles of the 1960s, in many cases, shine with a reflecting sheen. Many times, forms of quite similar color will interact with one another through the subtle differences in this reflectivity. Here, one of the enormous murals from the Seagram Murals series, which we have a really, I think, very compelling room in the second half of the exhibition. The technique probably stemmed from my father's work on the Seagram Mural Commission. Here he was often painting burgundy-colored rectangles on a burgundy-colored background, causing the rectangles to stand out from the background by means of their greater reflectivity. And he also worked the same magic in black, as you can see from this actually lone example of black-on-black painting, which is at the center of the room in our own exhibition. While the visual impact of this change of technique can be relatively subtle, the emotional impact is quite significant. The 1950s paintings invited you in. These paintings are keeping you more at arm's length. It is, after all, hard to lose yourself in a painting that is shining back at you. It is not, however, that the works of the 1960s is cold or unemotive. It is simply that they make more explicit what had been implicit in the work all along. These paintings are about you. Rothko is almost literally holding up a mirror for you to see yourself in. The clearest and most all-encompassing example of this effect is the Rothko Chapel in Houston. Not simply a group of murals, but an entire space designed by my father in the 1960s, it is generally regarded as the very culmination of his work, although there are those who find it off-putting. Those who don't like the chapel and the atmosphere my father created speak of it as a cold place with paintings that are unyielding. monochromes that don't engage the viewer visually or emotionally. There's simply not enough there to stimulate. These viewers are absolutely correct. There was something, and have given what I'm sure is an accurate account of their experience. There was something missing at the Rothko Chapel, an absolutely critical element: themselves. This is not to find fault with those people. The chapel is a very unsettling place. You feel very much alone. Nothing comes from the paintings. It is all about you. It's almost a formula for an instant existential crisis. And I will tell you that I initially had a very similar experience. I spent my first 2 hours in the Rothko Chapel alone on a morning about more than 20 years ago now. It was before opening time, and everything was absolutely silent. And I can tell you, I had to fight a very strong compulsion to leave. I felt so isolated in that empty space, like a tiny speck in a great universe. I resisted the urge to flee, however, and as I walked around that octagon, surrounded by huge murals on all sides, I began to realize that what I was uncomfortable with was not the paintings or the space. I was uncomfortable with myself. I was in a room full of mirrors, dark, unyielding mirrors, and I was standing at their point of coincidence so that they were all reflecting back on me. The next hour was a process of adjusting to looking at myself, and only myself, and learning from what I saw. It was deeply rewarding, but truly unnerving. I had a somewhat similar experience a decade later. When the Tate Modern opened in London, there were several mammoth Louise Bourgeois sculptures in the still more mammoth entrance hall. 3 of these sculptures, named beguilingly I Do, I Undo, and I Redo, were towers you could climb up with a small observation deck at the top. Mounted on the deck were 4 mirrors, by means of which you could look at various parts of the hall. When you stood in the center, however, the 4 mirrors showed you only different views of yourself. More playful than the Rothko Chapel, and certainly less overwhelming, but I think ultimately sending a similar message and getting us to look the same place for answers. The Rothko Chapel makes clear what I've learned is true of all Rothkos. They yield only what you put in. The paintings only work, they will only speak to our inner worlds when we are open to their invitation or suggestion. Ultimately, to understand a Rothko is to understand what the paintings help us see in ourselves. Thank you very much.